Bring in Glenn Ignazio. He's a military expert, retired Air Force Special Operations Commander. He's in Scottsdale, Arizona. Glenn, good to see you again. Appreciate your time. Here we are now, day 5. Your thoughts on what we are going to see from Israel in the days ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be with you again. Yes, as I think the prior gentleman said it perfectly, is that we have dark days ahead of us. You have a tremendous amount of effort and forces going into Gaza from Israel. You have a tremendous amount of preparation from Hamas, as you mentioned. There, you see, there's tunnels. There's going to be booby traps. There's narrow areas for military to operate. A lot of these is going to be what we call dismounted troops. A lot of ground troops are going to have to move through Gaza because of the density. But the other thing is, like we said, with the hostages, and that's been a big concern for many, is we don't know where we are. My secondary job was combat rescue. So getting hostages and getting people out of bad situation is what my history is. And you have to have a tremendous amount of intelligence and information. So when you're not hurting people and you're not hurting the hostages. So we've got some bleak times and challenging times ahead of us. And honestly, I just pray that innocent is not lost. But unfortunately, with the situation, it's going to be a very bloody combat. I hate to say it.
If Israel does go into Gaza in an incursion, as it certainly seems likely to be, what sort of preparations need to happen to try and have a successful operation?
Good question. So there's a couple of things. First, Gaza is very contained because of the walls and so forth, and you do have a lot of basically blockades in the ocean, so they're going to not be able to get supplies. So there's sort of a siege possibility here where they're starving them out. There's no fuel, there's no water, there's no food. But that affects both normal civilians and Hamas. But the same thing is when the forces go in, and what we do is, and the Israelis do this as well, is prepare the battlefield. That's why you see a lot of airstrikes, is you take out command and control centers, you take out the most resistance that the ground troops may encounter. And that's one of the things that they've been doing. Then at that point, the ground troops will then go in. And again, you have to think about this. This is a three-dimensional battle space because, you have these buildings that people can shoot down at you. So it's not just on the ground. It's literally three-dimensional. You have to think above and now with the tunnels below. So that's really how they're going to do it, is try to prepare the battlefield, get the best intelligence that they can, and then go and directly attack Hamas as best as possible. But you don't know who your enemy is when you're dealing with terrorists. They just look like any other civilian.
We know that thousands of members of Hamas were killed in the attack. I'm curious, hard to figure out how many people are part of this here, and how many people are part of the leadership of Hamas. You're trying to find them, you're trying to take them out. This is very difficult work to do. And again, there are questions about Israeli intelligence not predicting this was going to happen, and how accurate that might be in terms of where these leaders of Hamas actually are.
Yeah, great points, because you have all these buildings, you have apartments, and what they may have used as a safe house and a command center, which may have been known in the past, they can easily shift and become mobile and work out of somebody's apartment. That's the difficulty. Now, the original troop size of Hamas was about 25,000 plus. And so that's definitely the actual fighters. Now, the other thing is you've galvanized, as you hear Israel and people have galvanized, you have to expect that on the other side as well, is that a lot of the Palestinians have galvanized with Hamas. So you might have more fighters than originally anticipated. The intelligence and why it wasn't, basically how Israel wasn't notified or able to detect the initial incursion from Hamas into Israel. There's definitely some areas about that. I think it was more complacency, unfortunately. But as far as the resources they have, and this is another reason why the carrier group, the U.S. carrier group is there, is that they're getting direct support in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance for planning. I don't see direct action from the United States, but I do see complete support logistically and from the intelligence side. So they're going to have a lot more than they did before.
Yeah, and in terms of what Israel is now going to do, it's not just with Gaza. There's also worries about Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon, and other areas too. The U.S. Deploying the USS Gerald Ford to try and stop other countries, for example, Iran, from trying to capitalize on all of this. So there's lots going on here, Glenn. Very, as you would call it, with your military background, dynamic environment.
Absolutely. And, when we were talking about a little bit about complacency, there was a lot of activity happening on West Bank before this Hamas incursion. And I mentioned 25,000 people. Now in Hezbollah has about 100,000 plus troops, and they're much more organized and much more ingrained and actually pretty significantly armed to the north. So one caution I've always said is to watch out to the north, because if there is an intent, and if Hezbollah and Hamas are tightly connected in this, once the Israeli forces and the IDF start getting engaged in Gaza in a heavily way, you have to think about all the borders and all the incursions, and if Hezbollah is going to jump in the mix. So you can't do 100%. You have to keep things in reserve, one, for replenishment, and two, for additional threats around the country, because they are surrounded by them.
We know that more than 2,000 civilians have been killed on both sides currently, Glenn. Let me ask you what you think is in store for some of those civilians living in the Gaza Strip.
Unfortunately, bleak times. So, you already have the cutoff of fuel, food, supplies, and so forth. And that applies to Hamas, and that applies to, civilians. And now Hamas being a terrorist and a militant type of organization, they have prepared for this, and they prepared for it for a while. So unfortunately, their fighters have probably many resources or reserves that they've planned for. The rest of the population, probably not. As we mentioned, it's only 25 miles north to south and only about 7 miles wide in Gaza, but it's 2.5 million, the most densely populated area in the world. So most of the civilians are going to be left behind. I hate to say it, but that's where we're going to see people starting to galvanize and see. I mean, honestly, Hamas and that connection to the civilians that are there, they're going to increase their amount of troops, because people are going to be very angry, even though Hamas brought this battle to bear.
This is just the beginning, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. This is a complicated situation. As I mentioned, you're going through the streets. This is going to be building by building, and you can see that the buildings are multi-floored. And again, the tunnels are an exceptional network of tunnels underneath the city. So as soon as the IDF goes through, they don't have it mapped out, at least that I know of. That maybe they do, but the idea that some of these groups can actually come back and surface behind IDF, they've got to take all that in consideration, and I know they are. But this is something that's going to be methodical. Maybe they break Gaza up in stages and attack different stages from different areas. I anticipate that. But it is going to be a complicated, dynamic, and one of the most dangerous situations. These are called military operations in urban terrain. It's a very dangerous and, unfortunately, dirty operation.
We often talk about how the Gaza Strip is blockaded, it's surrounded, but I'm just curious, how is Hamas getting all of those rockets? And we continue to see them even right now, Glenn, as you and I are speaking, flying out of Gaza, being fired back into Israel.
Yes, what has happened is, look, the last 2 years dealing with Hamas, it's actually been very quiet. That's where I sort of bring the complacency thing in. It's insidious, but that's the intelligence. But Hamas has had a tremendous amount of time to plan this. The other thing is Hamas's prior operations, I don't know how to say it other than it's been more bumbling. Now it's been exceptionally organized, where their incursions were 22 different locations simultaneously. So their planning practice, their supplies, logistics, and weaponry has been stored for a tremendous amount of days, months, I would definitely say. In addition, when people are saying Iran's not involved, look, Iran is involved. If they stopped supplying them a month ago, they're implicitly definitely connected to this. That's how Hamas gets all of their warfare, gets all of their weapons. Same thing with Hezbollah. And a lot of the things they have underground or they have hidden, and again, they're mostly mobile. So as soon as they fire, they're able to fire, forget, and move to another location. So like I said, that's where intelligence is going to have to be pristine in this. And it's a very dangerous situation, especially when you're dealing with something underground.
Glenn, I appreciate you taking the time, joining us again in Canada, tapping into your military expertise. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care of yourself.